Thank you, Hal, and thank you all for joining this webinar. I'm going to be talking about e-bikes and generating the new wave of cyclists. Primarily, my talk is going to be about two different research studies that we have conducted here at OTREC and Portland State University over the last year, and I'm going to be providing those results. So here's the outline of today's webinar, and let's jump into why do e-bikes matter. Well, most of you realize that our current transportation sector has significant impacts on our society, be it safety impacts, causing fatalities and crashes, and the significant economic impacts to safety-related incidents. But also there are accessibility and mobility issues with delay. There's economic impacts to households and of course environmental impacts. And as we struggle to particularly look at environmental impacts, and cities around the country are developing climate action plans, here's an example of Portland's Commute mode share and the vision in which they would like to get to by 2030 is to increase biking by 25% and basically trying to reduce that drive alone by, for commuters. But the big question is, and the struggle is, how do we increase bicycling around the country when it's at such low levels now? And here's a graph kind of showing the different large cities around the country. And Portland's here at around 6% right now, and that's a really big jump to go from 6% to 25%. So how do we do this? I mean, this is something that, as a lot of people kind of like point out, that Portland is special. They're doing biking, but you know, if you look at all the other cities here, Minneapolis, Washington, Denver, all the way down, there are activities around bicycling that are happening right now. And they all are struggling with increasing the mode share for bicycling. So let's think, this is talking about the different types of people that cycle. And this comes from work from Roger Geller and then Jennifer Dill and Nate McNeil in kind of outlining who the typologist is and percentage of people bicycling and what type they are. And we're really looking at this area of how do we get these people, the interested and concerned, this 56%, in the 31%, to kind of be more excited about bicycling and shifting those people into positions where they feel more comfortable and like you can see in the Strong and Fearless, very excited about bicycling. So why don't people bike? Well, there's lots of different reasons. There's safety issues, there's lack of infrastructure, weather. You know, here in Portland, there's days even I don't like to ride in the rain. It can be inconvenient because of different types of trips you need to do throughout the day. Logistic issues, lack of fitness, time, and confidence. So there's lots of different reasons why people don't bike. But more particularly, you know, let's look. There's people that are older that, you know, they might not feel comfortable or it's too difficult to ride, but they still want to participate. There's people that live in hilly areas. When I bike home, I have a nice gradual incline, and some days I just don't want to do that little hill. But and as you look across the country, how our cities have developed and where people live, sometimes their commutes are greater than 5 miles, and 5 miles is kind of that, you know, kind of natural cutoff where people feel I live too far. I need to drive, or I need to look for some other types of transportation. And then we also have people with physical limitations that make cycling difficult. And be it that they find it too hard or effort, or they have some type of physical illness or disability that is just too hard to put that much effort into bicycling. We also, women tend to bike less than men for various different reasons, and right now they make up about 25% of the bike trips in the U.S., where in places like Japan and in China, it's more 50-50. So how do we get more women biking? People don't feel safe because of the lack of infrastructure or biking in traffic with larger vehicles, and how do they build confidence? Also, people don't want to commute and get sweaty or wear special clothes. I mean, as you can see in this far slide here, these people are biking, but they don't seem as happy and clean as this nice people that just rolled up to work on their e-bikes. But also, I think everybody's seen the kind of more avid bicycler with the bike gear biking to work, and that can be intimidating for people, feeling like I don't see myself wearing really tight pants bicycling. Also, it's that people carry stuff, and we all haul stuff. And this is just some pictures of some current e-bikes. The top two pictures are actually just recent rollouts in Europe. FedEx and UPS are kind of playing around with the idea of e-bikes and bicycling for delivery. But people, we all need to stop and shop, and how do we carry that? And finally, at the bottom here is, how do we move family members, kids, in a non-traditional kind of car format? So what are the critical pieces to increase cycling? Typically we've kind of focused on the infrastructure side and programs and policies to encourage more people to bicycle. And then, how do we change people's attitudes and get more people biking? Well, what's missing from this is, I think, a critical part, technology. Can technology help in this puzzle to get more people biking? So what is an e-bike? An e-bike is, as you can imagine, a bicycle, but it's electrified. And in a typical e-bike, you'll see obviously a battery. There will be motors that can either be in the hub of the bike's wheels, or they can be in the chain drive, like this one. They also have powers and gears that are usually around on the handlebars, in which you can accelerate the bike or move the bike. They come in all shapes and sizes, and as you can see, you get ones that are more like what I just described, but also three-wheel bikes. We have commuter folding bikes. We have cargo exercycle type of bikes with conversions on them, but ones that also even look more like a moped. There are basically two types of e-bikes. They can be kind of categorized. One in what we call a throttle or powered bicycle, in which when I was talking about the controls, it's all done with the throttle. So as you're biking, the throttle is what makes the motor move, and that's done by the hand. The other is what is commonly referred to as a pedaling, more in Europe than in the United States, but that's called a power assist, where as you are biking, the bike senses the torque on the pedal and provides assistance through the motor. What is not considered an e-bike, and particularly for this, the kind of work that we're doing, both in the survey that I'm going to talk about and kind of the regulatory aspects, are mopeds and scooters. And why we're kind of excluding them out of this is that these typically go faster, in particular this moped goes faster than what we will be talking about as a speed cutoff, and then scooters which don't have kind of pedals. Now, these are both very important transportation devices, and I don't want to belittle how people move around and how important these can be to get people to move around. But I'm just trying to kind of more discuss what we're determining as a defined electric bicycle. So a big question is how much faster are e-bikes? And this is a commonly question that people ask, and particularly as we get into the policy discussion. Well, right now is if you look at AASHTO's design guideline for bike facilities, they are expecting bikes to go from 8 to 15 miles on paved level terrain, or as you're going downhill, as you can imagine, you're going faster, up to 20 to 30 miles per hour, or uphill is 5 to 12. In a study in 1980, they were able to kind of look at the differences in the speeds of bikes in different bike facilities. And as you can imagine, bikes vary greatly. I mean, I am commonly passed by people even biking in Portland, and so within different facilities you get a wide range. And this is kind of confirmed by Landis in 2004, basically saying that the average bicyclist is going about 11 miles an hour on average. But only 1% were going more than 20 miles an hour on an average trip. Now, Cherry and he both looked at, this is in China, looked at conventional bikes versus e-bikes, and they found that they were about 30% faster, but you're looking at 7 miles per hour to 9 miles an hour. And then also Cherry and Langford, at a study that they're doing at the University of Tennessee with some e-bike sharing, also kind of confirmed this kind of ranges around e-bikes versus conventional bikes. Another recent study, it was done in Sweden, and you can kind of see that we're getting at 8 miles per hour for an average traditional bike, and e-bikes getting up to about 14 miles an hour. What's interesting is looking at the variation of traditional bikes versus that kind of clumping of e-bikes that they typically are peaking at the same speed, but there's not that big of range distribution on their speeds. So are e-bikes here? Well, in the rest of the world they are. We're looking at about 29 million e-bikes are sold in 2012, and that estimate is only looking to go up. Mostly that's coming out of Asia, as you can see from this chart, but also in Europe is where we're seeing a wide growth of e-bikes, particularly as conventional bike sales have continued to decline in the Netherlands. We've seen at 11%, they've declined by 11%, but we've seen an increase in bike sales of e-bikes by 6%. So even in bike-friendly and bike-predominant countries, we're seeing a rise in e-bike sales. Now in the U.S., we're kind of getting there. We're starting, as you can, if anybody around this webinar has seen, I see more and more e-bikes every day, and this is in Portland, but also in other cities. So we are less than other countries around the world, but we are projecting growth. So that makes us kind of say, well, what do we need to do to deal with e-bikes in the United States? So we just completed a kind of a scan of U.S. regulations and policies. This report is currently in review and very shortly will be out for anyone on this webinar and also people viewing this webinar. It will be posted on our website that I'll mention later, but also we'll can always, if you're interested, email you a link to that paper when it comes out very shortly. So around the world, you can see the definitions of, here's a table of definitions of e-bikes. And they vary. U.S. defines e-bikes differently than Canada, than the EU, and China. In general, though, they are kind of clumped in that there's something about power, something about the motor, something about speed, something about how you engage that motor, and then also something dealing with pedals. And that partly is that to differentiate them from what you would think is a scooter or a motorcycle. So in the U.S., so this is a federal definition of an e-bike. Now, this e-bikes in 2002, a law was passed that gave the Consumer Product Safety Commission the kind of the authority to regulate e-bikes as bicycles. So it took it out of NHTSA's hands and gave it to the Consumer Products Commission, Safety Commission. The Act defines an electric bike in the United States as a 2- or 3-wheeled vehicle, fully operable pedals, with an electric motor less than 750 watts. But the key thing here is that the speed cannot be more than 20 miles an hour under the power of the motor. Now, this regulation only pertains to manufacturing in the first sale. So here's the confusing part. In that same law, it talks about, this section shall supersede any state law and requirements with respect to e-bikes. This is continually being used around the country by dealers and people riding bikes, thinking that this law, this definition, defines e-bikes and supersedes state law. Well, state law federal law does not define how you use the bike. It only defines the safety issues and the manufacturing of the bike. States define and define the devices also, but they also determine where it can be used. And that's where that the confusing part is that actually only talks about that states can't say that a manufacturer needs to do something other to the bike for safety reasons or how it's manufactured. It has nothing to do with use. So many states use regulations because they don't have e-bike regulations, that they're governing and putting these bikes under moped, motorcycle, motorized bicycles, motor scooters, motor-driven cycles. So big confusions, lots of terminologies that are not consistent. In Oregon, we have our state law defines an e-bike as basically like the feds do, but has an additional kind of says that a bike can be an e-bike at 1,000 watts. Well, it also adds that you have to be 16 years and older to ride it. So the question is, if you had a bike that was 1,000 watts, would that be under the Consumer Product Safety Commission or back to NHTSA? So there's some confusion here. Well, so basically, states define these devices and also determine how they're used. And I'm going to go into some of the research here in a second. Many cities defer to the state regulations, as we found in the classification, but some cities are addressing e-bikes on their own. And mostly, this is because they're trying to find out or determine where these e-bikes can be used, particularly around shared use paths. And particularly Boulder, Eugene, Bloomfield, and Toronto, and even Chicago are putting in regulation, local ordinances about can e-bikes be used in those facilities. Now, a unique case is New York and New York State, where in New York, at the state, motorized devices can't be registered in New York, including motorized assisted bicycles. In 2013, last year, the city of New York also passed a ban particularly for businesses using bicycles for commercial purposes. They should not use motorized scooters. And partly this was driven out of safety, that these delivery carriers for restaurants and other type of businesses were going around the city, and there was a pushback on that they were zipping in and out of sidewalks and bike paths, and there was a lot of concern about pedestrian safety, bike safety, and they wanted to ban motorized scooters. What this does not talk about is, and as you see this definition, it says solely by, they can't be propelled without human power. So this really is banning the throttle e-bike. It is not very clear about the pedelec type of e-bike, where we have seen some manufacturers and dealers believe that the an e-bike that is pedelec should be legal and should be used within New York City. Now, there is a proposed bill in both the Assembly and the Senate right now, and that would basically get the definition of e-bikes in line with the CPSC definition, the federal definition. But what it adds is two things. One, and more particularly, which is kind of concern, is that it bans passengers under the age of 16 to be on a e-bike. Now, if you remember that slide where the mother is carrying a bunch of kids on a cargo bike, that would be outlawed within the state. So the question is, should that or should that not be? So here's kind of our results from our recent scan around the country and Canada. Looking at minimum age, we see a wide range of who can use an e-bike, from no minimum age all the way down to 12 years of age. So my kids here in Portland would not be able to ride a electric e-bike to school because we have 16 years and older. Here are the states that classify e-bikes as a bicycle. Now, this is important because when we talk about infrastructure, it really kind of equates to where these bikes can be used. Here are the states that have e-bike specific definitions. You see, kind of a handful of, about half of them have actually e-bike specific definitions, where the other ones are using proxies such as mopeds, motorized scooters, motorized driven cycles as some type of definition. Here are the states that would require driver's licenses or some type of licensing or a vehicle registration to use an e-bike. So the question is, they're putting more restrictions on people using these as bicycles. This graph or map shows the different power, maximum power, and they range from, particularly in Canada, which is kind of standardized at 500 watts. But in the U.S., it ranges from the 750, which is the kind of the federal definition, up to 1,000. And you see a lot of these states like Oregon and Minnesota and California, and that put the definition above the federal definition, which I think creates some confusion, though you can certainly have more power in your motor and not make it go faster. Here, as we talk about speed limits, in general, they've kept the speed limits within the regulations under 20 miles an hour, but because of how states define the e-bikes, that it could be mopeds or scooters, that they do in some states allow the bikes to go 25 to 30 miles an hour. So really, there are these questions around that as we look at policy and the implications of those, that you can really kind of talk about them within these three categories. Within technology, what does it mean to have different size motors? What does it mean what speed do we want these bikes to go? The question is weight. If we remember the slide of all the different types of e-bikes, bikes can weigh between what you would think a conventional bike would weigh up to a moped, 100+ pounds. And then what are the safety issues about the bikes at those weights? And then the big question is about this functionality of pedals. And as you kind of can imagine with bikes that qualify under the federal definition of e-bikes, they might not have functional pedals. The moped pedals tend to be kind of to start the engine or move, very slowly. But you certainly couldn't ride some of those bikes, more than a a mile using those pedals. Questions about riders and passengers. Do we want age limits for the bikes? Do we want restrictions for helmets? You know, many states don't have helmet laws for bicyclists. Do we want licensing? Do we want registration, where these are typically more in the motorcycle and scooter and moped categories? And finally, on use is, where should we allow e-bikes to be used? And this is, I think, where the big debate is happening right now around both protected bike lanes, bike lanes in the roadways, shared use paths, and sidewalks, and then also trails even. So, you know, how do you feel about these e-bikes? And, you know, and when we talk about technology, you know, I'm talking about, you know, ever-evolving technology. So when we talk about ones that are more scooter-like but have pedals, you know, is this an e-bike, even though this qualifies under the federal definition? This is, you know, somebody who has electrified their luggage. It seems a very commuter kind of friendly device. But, you know, how about just a plain scooter, or these devices that are, you know, this is a organic transit's ELPS. This is an electric bike, meets all the definitions, but it's bigger and it takes more room out of the bike lane. So how do conventional bicyclists think of these bikes in bike lanes, in shared use bike lanes? And I think that's a big question as more of these devices are coming about, but also as we're trying to get more people biking, and for different reasons. So now I'm going to jump into kind of a overview of the survey that we did here at Portland State, and talk about what we found. So our basic research question is really in what we're looking at here at Portland State University is, how do we get more people to bike, and how do we get more people to bike more often? And will e-bikes do this? So we developed a national survey. We adopted a survey instrument from Monash University that we partnered with. We had done the same survey in Australia. And we put the survey out and tried to get as many people that were bike owners. And we got 553 bike owners in the United States. This was done last year in March to July. And we pushed it out mostly through social media and various different mechanisms to get it out. But we were also able to get some people in postcards out within the Portland region, particularly, to get e-bike users. As you can imagine, it's very hard to go sit at a corner and wait to do an intercept survey for e-bike users. So we had to kind of look at different ways. So here's a kind of a geographic dispersion, which looks pretty. I think we did a fair share about getting kind of graphically dispersed responses. And here's some of the results. Basically, we got more men and women, and partly this is because of where I think we sent the survey, or who picked it up, most, you know, through kind of more tech-oriented websites and forums. But still, in general, the e-bike users were older, more educated, and at higher incomes, what we saw. But we also saw, this I thought was interesting, that 30% indicated that they had some type of physical condition that made it difficult to ride a standard bike. But in general, people felt that they rated themselves in good health. Purchase decisions, I think this was kind of interesting that we found, is that half the people basically had purchased an e-bike, but the other half had converted a standard bike, or had a standard bike converted to electric assist. And I think that is particularly interested in this kind of cargo bike, and as I point out back to the slide with the woman with the kids, but also people carrying goods, is that people are using those to kind of realize they need to move more goods or people, but they need the help to do it, because it's heavy to move 3 kids on your cargo bike. But in general, we look at when those bikes were purchased, you know, we're seeing, as we can imagine, a higher tick of e-bike purchases in the most recent years. But I also, we looked at where conversions were done, and those were typically in the older bikes. So these are more new purchases of e-bikes. So I think as we see you know, in later years we're going to see more e-bikes versus conversions, but we don't know yet. Quickly, I think we see a range. So of cost of e-bikes from $500 to over $2,500. So there's not just that idea that these are really expensive bikes. We can you can still pay one for about $500 to $1,000. So what are the main reasons they bought an e-bike? Well, some people looked at for replacing trips, and we saw this, as you can imagine, people without physical limitations were replacing car trips. So those are the kind of, I think, the commuters. For health, we saw people with physical limitations saying that this is one of the main reasons that they purchased ones. For increased fitness, we saw people over 55 saying that they bought it for versus under 55 to increase physical fitness. For hilly areas, we saw a difference between the male and female people. And then to ride with less effort, this was, you know, as you can imagine, with physical limitations. What were the main reasons they bought it? For the use and for commuting. We saw this with people under 55 without physical limitations, so that kind of makes sense. And then people over 55 with physical limitations tended to use it for recreations, which also makes sense, that why people over 55 are using bikes or want to use bikes is to get out and recreate or get some physical fitness. In general, bike use, I thought this was really interesting part of the study, that 94% of the people said they had ridden a standard bike as an adult. Of those, 55% had ridden their bike weekly before they bought the e-bike. But after the e-bike, it went up to 93%. And then of those 6% of the people that had not ridden a bike as an adult, that went up to 89% that they rode it daily, weekly after purchasing the e-bike. So we're seeing that they're biking more as they bought an e-bike. Now, getting around, we saw that people said that they, from a standard bike, that 45% of the people indicated that they chose they would take a different route, and that 35% didn't avoid hills or would take a more direct path instead of with their standard bike. And then about 3/4 said that they would ride to different destinations because they had an e-bike from when they had a standard bike. In looking at these different destinations, and this is where we saw some difference between the male and female. Particularly, women said that they took a different route, would take a different route with their e-bike than they would have with the standard bike, and where men were only at 42%. But a bigger jump was at different destinations. So doing different things, such as running errands or going places that are further. 82% of the women said that they would do different destinations than riding a standard bike. In general, these are the main advantages people said that they liked about riding an e-bike. And as you can imagine speed and riding with less effort. But this was fun, was not one of the things that we had asked them about. This was under the other category. They were self-selecting fun. And we saw this a lot in the written responses, that it changed some of these people's outlook on biking. And I think that's kind of an interesting response. Here are the main disadvantages to riding an e-bike. And as you can imagine, weight, you're carrying more with the battery and the motor. But some of these, like none. there's no disadvantage to riding e-bike. And weather is really a non-related e-bike issue. It's more of a biking issue. So I do want to say that there are some limitations to the survey. We don't have a response rate. We have really no idea how many people have e-bikes in the United States right now. We have some estimates, but we don't really have a response rate. The method in which we basically pushed out the survey, and we're using self-reported use. But in general, I think this gives us a fairly good idea of who these people are and why they use e-bikes. So survey conclusions, I do think the survey results do show that they have potential to get more people biking. As you can see from some of these responses that they live in hilly areas, the places they would not have biked before, but because they have an e-bike, they're biking, or they're older, legally blind, living in a semi-rural area. They would never have done that in a biking way, or maybe not even made those trips without the e-bike. And it also encourages people to bike more often, and I think the results kind of show that. So conclusions, I think there's evidence that suggests that e-bikes are becoming more prevalent in the United States. So this is important for policymakers and other people to recognize that we need to kind of think about how we're going to deal with technology in the bike world. E-bikes can get more people biking and biking more often. As I said, technology should be added to bike promotion and planning dialogue. So we shouldn't just be talking about the idea of what we conventionally think of as a bike. I think as you will seen through the presentation, but more so in the paper that we have, is that the federal and state regulatory landscape needs to be standardized to decrease confusion and really to help the market grow, both for the industry to be able to sell their products, but also for consumers to understand and for us to know how to regulate them. Transportation agencies need to understand how these technologies should be designed, regulated, and integrated into our transportation system. And then finally, to understand kind of these questions about, should e-bikes be given the same, be distinguished as bicycles, and then really, what are the safety implications by adding these bicycles within shared use paths, trails, in other places within our transportation system? So here's my contact information. I did a more detailed webinar on the survey results from the user survey that we did back in October of this year, and that webinar is posted on ebikeresearch.pdx.edu. Also, the paper for that is posted, and we will be posting the paper on the state regs and federal regulation policy paper there shortly. I'd like to thank Professor Dill, Nicholas, and Mark for helping on this research project and what they've been doing both on that and other projects we're working on. And also special thanks to Jeffrey Rose and Marilyn Johnson at Monash for letting us use their survey instrument, and Chris Cherry for his assistance and review throughout these projects. So quickly, here are the references for people. These will be posted if you want to look at them later on, and I am available for questions now.
Great, thanks, John. For those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them in the question pane. I do have a few questions for John. What are the health implications of a person riding an e-bike versus a conventional bicycle?
Right. I kind of imagined somebody was going to ask that question, so I put up a couple slides that I wanted to kind of talk about this. And this is kind of, as you can imagine, you hear this a lot within the kind of discussion about e-bikes, that you're cheating using an e-bike. Are people going to get the exercise that they need by using an e-bike? Well, if we look at health impacts and how we kind of would measure physical activity, it's done on this, METs, the metabolic equivalent, kind of talking about, how much activity you're getting. And in general, the CDC recommends that you get 2.5 hours of moderate exercise a week to be physically active. Various studies, there hasn't been a lot, but there's, here are 3 studies that all show that people that ride e-bikes got the needed moderate level of physical activity needed by riding an e-bike, but they didn't get the vigorous activity. So, when you're trying to kind of look at that 2.5 hours, that an e-bike you would have to ride that amount of time. With a regular bike, you would probably have to ride less to meet that equivalent. And Jeff Rose, really quickly, this is a kind of I think illuminates this a little bit. He did a study where they had a conventional bike and an e-bike. Here's the conventional bike, it's the dark blue line. Here's an e-bike, it's the pink line. And heart rate, as you can imagine, you're not using as much of physical exertion, as they went through this route. And here's a car where you're actually just sitting within the car, not doing any physical exercise. But in general, they looked at the heart rate zone, and that you were within that range, you were actually getting the targeted amount of beats per minute to get to that physical activity level.
Great. So we do have another question. Are there any examples of e-bike share programs in the United States? For example, for borrowing a bike to haul larger cargo occasionally?
Yeah. There are 2 e-bike bike sharing programs that I know of. The first one is the University of Tennessee's cycle share program, and that has been going on for about 2 years on campus, where they have a I don't know how many e-bikes they have, but it's a conventional bikes and e-bike system where they're sharing those bikes, and students are using them for trips around campus. And certainly you can go to Chris Cherry's website and read all about that. And then they're about to launch one in San Francisco. And I don't know much more than that if it's launched or not, but I know they got some grant money to buy some e-bikes for a bike sharing program. I don't know of any cargo bikes that are for share, like the idea of Zipcar, that here's I need a bigger e-bike and I'm going to use that for share. I don't know that.
Okay. So at this point, what are the biggest barriers to e-bike adoption?
I think the biggest barrier is, number one, I think this federal definition and the state definition of needs to be standardized. And that one is for the industry to understand what an e-bike is, so that they can sell the appropriate bike for the technology and put it on the market. But also, I think states need to kind of determine where an e-bike should be, what's appropriate. This, I think, needs to be discussed and debated. I think, as you can see, there are maybe more aggressive locations like New York City where it's an all-out ban, and I think there's some flexibility in that where we need to basically say, there is a difference between an e-bike and a moped and a scooter, so that's a big barrier. I also think just having more people biking and seeing more people using e-bikes is a barrier, but that can be overcome.
Do you know of any programs where a governmental agency subsidized or government agency subsidized purchase of e-bikes for residents?
Purchase of e-bikes for residents? No, I don't off the top of my head. I apologize. I do know that this has been debated in Oregon in in basically the bigger class of low-speed electric vehicles, in which they are wanting to get tax incentives to buy kind of low-speed electric vehicles, but that could be a four-wheel car all the way down to an e-bike. And I do know those have been debated around the country a little bit. I don't know of any state or local city in the U.S. that has gone so far to actually give incentives.
Okay, great. So the next two are related to charging stations. Do any cities around the world have networks of e-bike recharge stations? And related to that, are you aware of any jurisdictions that have set up charging stations for e-bikes?
Well, luckily, e-bikes can be charged by the million charging stations around your office, your building. They're very easy to charge because they all use 110 outlets. Now that said, you're probably referring to more in the public right-of-way or in bike parking lots or corrals. Portland has on Electric Avenue one kind of outlet for e-bikes in this part of the roadway in which they allow other charging vehicles. But I am not very aware of any other city that has put in a bank within a like a bike parking corral. Now there is some in the Netherlands where some of the bike corrals where they are getting people to drop off their bikes and then commute and walk into work. They do have outlets to plug in. The other thing is where I don't know if this is as big of an issue as it is with heavier weight vehicles, where many of these bicycles, the battery is very easy to unlock, pull out, and walk into your office and charge. So the idea of needing bike infrastructure a bike charging infrastructure is, I think, needs to be kind of thought more closely.
And so we have one last question. You talked about various aspects of e-bikes, but what about the cost of an e-bike? If somebody is interested in buying an e-bike, what is the starting cost for an entry-level e-bike?
Right. Well, I had that graph up. I think I can really quickly go to our survey results, and I think this shows a pretty. I apologize for anybody. Is that there's this range from $500 to $2,500. Really, as you can see, is the conversions are at the lower cost level. You could buy in dealers around the country, and right now an average bike is around $1,500 for a bike. Now conversions are less, but that's because you're buying the motor and putting it onto an existing capital cost of the bike. But in talking to some e-bike manufacturers, they are saying that really the better bikes are basically about $2,000. And this is a barrier. I mean, when people think about the cost of purchasing, that seems like a lot to pay for a bike. But if you look at reducing your trips and paying for gas, and depending on the price of gas, that can be easily kind of paid for depending on how much you use it. So I do recognize this as a barrier, but also I acknowledge that it might not be that big of a barrier to get more people biking.
Actually, we do have one more question.
Okay.
What about standardization of batteries? Battery replacements can become very expensive or impossible to get. Any movement in that direction?
I don't know that much about the standardization of batteries, other than what I've been told a couple times from some e-bike manufacturers, that they are moving more and more towards standardized batteries and controls, And but this is going to be a problem as there are more and more smaller shops, coming up, people building their own e-bikes and selling them, that you're going to have issues about standardization. I do think it's an issue, and it has been a big issue for electric vehicles. But I think it's something that the industry is going to have to deal with as more e-bikes come on the market.
Great, thanks, John. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks again to John for sharing his research. We are looking for your feedback so that we can continue to offer relevant webinars in the near future. Please be on the lookout for an email with a short evaluation survey. We will also be in touch with you with information about professional development credits, and you can view other IBPI professional development offerings on our website at www.pdx.edu/IBPI. Thanks again for joining us.